I don't necessarily think you need to do that with what would be a massively complex, difficult, and horrendously expensive in terms of blood and treasure amphibious invasion of Crimea. But I do think you can make Crimea impossible for the Russians to hold on to. And to me, that is the center of gravity. And if Ukraine can hold on in its eastern provinces, continue to push back the Russians, or firstly to hold, but to push them back, but to focus on what I think is Russia's center of gravity here, which is Ukraine, and not just military, but political center of gravity, and make it impossible for Russia to hold on to through the application of long-range precision missiles and the like, then I think things could change very, very quickly.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by General Sir Richard Shirreff, NATO's former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe and the author of 2017 War with Russia, an urgent warning from senior military command. General Shirreff, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Thank you for having me, and good to be back, James.
First of all, I wonder if you can just provide us with your key takeaways from the NATO summit last week. Did it go far enough in terms of support for Ukraine for your liking?
The answer to that direct question is a direct no, it didn't. But at the same time, I recognize that NATO and where NATO goes is about the art of the possible, because you have to remember that getting the consensus of 32 different nations is a challenge. Where does NATO need to go? What should have come out? First, I think a clear statement should have come out that NATO is committed to supporting Ukraine in the defeat of Russia. No ifs, no buts. This is not a war that is going to end in negotiation. This is not something like the Northern Ireland peace process. This is closer to World War I or World War II. They did not end with negotiation. Putin will never accept a negotiation. And if he does, it'll only be negotiation on the basis that he gets exactly what he wants. So NATO should have come up. I think this was the real opportunity in its 75th anniversary summit with a clear statement that NATO will develop and put together a strategy to support Ukraine in the defeat of Russia. But that was clearly a bridge too far this time. So what did we get? We got a statement, some good words about about NATO continuing to support Ukraine in its irreversible path to full Euro-Atlantic integration, including NATO membership, which is a great statement. But implicit in that is defeat of Russia. And NATO has shied away from that.
And I suppose also an irreversible path. It's strong language, but it does raise the question of, well, what is the time frame, therefore? Are we talking about Ukraine becoming a NATO member in a decade? Are we talking about 5 years' time? Or are we talking about a path to membership that might happen in the next 6 to 12 months? It's very open-ended. What is your sense of the likely timescale?
You're absolutely right. It's very open-ended, and there was no timescale. And of course, strategy is about the integration of ends which in a sense is that this is a statement of the ends for Euro-Atlantic integration, including Ukraine as a member of NATO. Now, that's a pretty clear statement, but it's about the ways and the means, the how you get there, or what do you need to do to get there, and the resources required to get you there as well. In terms of the war, my sense is that this is a long war. It's already, let's be clear, it's already a 12-year war. This war started in 2014. It didn't start in 2022. And I think this is going to run for easily, and actually in World War II terms, if you date it from the full-scale Russian invasion 2 years ago, maybe we're sort of 1941, 42. So I think we could be looking at another 2, if not longer, years, because you only have to look at what needs to be done. Where is the war right now? Well, it's Russia has got the strategic initiative. Russia has been pressing hard. We haven't seen the sort of full scale spring, early summer offensive that many expected and that was forecast. But nevertheless, Russia continues to grind down Ukraine in its eastern territories at vast expense. I mean, incomprehensible expense to us in the West, to Russia, but it doesn't care. Russia continues to conduct and commit the most appalling war crimes. Witness the deliberate, deliberate attack on a children's hospital with children going through chemotherapy with drips attached to them, being evacuated, covered in blood and dust from that attack. I mean, that was deliberate state policy. And it was deliberate state policy by the current chair of the UN Security Council, an organization under the terms of the UN Charter of Human Rights committed to removing aggression. Well, how cynical and revolting is that? So, there's a long way to go here. And Ukraine has not only got to defend itself, it's got to build up its armed forces, particularly its army, and it's got to build up its air force. The delivery of F-16s is only, it was heralded with great triumph at the NATO summit. But have you seen a photograph of an F-16 landing in Ukraine yet? Question mark. Maybe they're not being released because of security reasons, but I haven't seen any pictures of that. So there's a heck of a long way to go here. And then, Ukraine needs the time to train the reserves it is mobilizing under the new terms of mobilization. It needs to build up its offensive capability in terms not just of individual training of soldiers, but of the collective training of battalions, of brigades, of divisions, and of corps. And it's got to bring online the host of additional military support from the West. So this is going to be a long run.
I'm glad you mentioned the F-16s, actually, because you're right. Their delivery was heralded at the NATO summit. We believe, according to reports, they'll be in the skies over Ukraine at some point this summer, though when exactly we do not know. But just the delivery of them, is that really enough? I mean, the time it takes to train an F-16 pilot. Speaking recently on Frontline to General Breedlove, who has flown F-16s in the past, and it said it took him 10 years to become an effective F-16 pilot. That's a massive challenge, is it not?
Yeah, well, you're talking to a tank commander here, and Phil Breedlove, who's a very old friend, he knows the drill, and I would listen to Phil anytime. He was my supreme commander when I was deputy. I would just highlight the fact not only is it about training the individual, but it's about training the organization, the army and the air force to cooperate. The integration of air into land operations is a complex business, and it's really complex in the sort of environment we find ourselves now, with the skies being dominated by drones, the ability of the enemy to see everything that is going on and to bring targeting to bear pretty quickly, which the Russians have demonstrated they're good at.
The issue of drone warfare, I think, is fascinating. I mean, we've seen huge innovation by both sides, but particularly the Ukrainians since the start of the full-scale invasion a couple of years ago. And just recently, we had Ukrainian drones striking an oil depot in the Rostov Oblast of Russia. Do you think, I mean, not just in this war, but longer term, drone warfare is going to become more and more crucial to modern combat?
Oh, I think that's axiomatic. That's self-evident in a sense that it is de facto critical to modern combat. But equally, I think you need to take a long view here, because drones are proliferating now, but be under no illusions. Measure is succeeded by countermeasure, as night follows day in military warfare. The tank is followed by the anti-tank, so the tank gets stronger and can overcome. So anti-tank weapons become more sophisticated. That's been the story of military conflict, since the days of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, and no doubt before that as well. So it will continue. Yeah, but I think the message is that 21st century conflict is, to say it's complex is an understatement. because not only are we expecting commanders to integrate the traditional, what you might call the traditional combined arms capabilities, which are still just as relevant, make no mistake about it, of tanks, armored infantry, armored engineers, artillery, air defense, logistics, all the paraphernalia that we became used to, and what frankly in my day in the British Army were pretty slick at doing. But you've also got to integrate that with drones, with cyber, with data-driven artillery, a whole host of new capabilities as well, which places a huge burden on young commanders and indeed soldiers.
Just to go back to some of the big takeaways from the NATO summit in Washington last week, there was a 40 billion euro package of military aid agreed by NATO member states for Ukraine. A number of countries agreed bilateral security arrangements as well. But it stopped short of a multi-year agreement that the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg had been pushing for. Why do you think it is that there is still this reluctance among, I don't know, some NATO member states to give Ukraine exactly what it needs? It feels a bit like we go part of the way, but not all the way.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to, in a sense, where we started, that NATO is a consensus organization. And let's be clear, for NATO to be the summit to be as strong as it was, I mean, take away just put it aside for a second, my criticisms of not going far enough. But the fact that it laid down unequivocally there is a path to Ukraine membership of NATO, to Euro-Atlantic integration. Okay, it didn't lay down any markers, but equally, as you say, the 40 billion package, the setting up of a NATO command to marshal and integrate current bilateral support and training. I mean, the announcement of the F-16s, and sort of slightly separate, but the Ukraine Compact, 21 nations coming together to combine bilateral security assistance into an integrated package. This is all good stuff. But why doesn't it go further? Quite simple, because not all nations will agree. And the fact that you've got Hungary's ticket on this agreement thus far, we all know where Hungary comes from. We've all seen Orban cozying up to Putin and Trump and setting himself up as a great peacemaker. And the fact is that Hungary signed up to it. So therefore, NATO is getting there. And as I always say, NATO has to move at the speed of the slowest ship in the convoy. And, Hungary is frankly a pretty slow ship, but they've got them on board still, and that's important.
You referenced the new NATO command centre that's going to be set up in Germany, I believe, that was announced last week. Just talk a bit about the significance of that.
Well, it's really important because up to now, there's been no NATO strategy for providing lethal aid to Ukraine. It's all been bilateral support by individual NATO nations through the US-led Ramstein Compact. This is NATO now saying, yeah, this is going to be done as an alliance, and that demonstrates alliance strength. And if you start this way, with NATO, it's small steps. I mean, we'd all prefer to see big steps, but this is a step on the way to a NATO strategy. The next step might be a NATO strategy to support Ukraine to unequivocally achieve defeat of Russia. Because to go back to that, nothing else is going to be any good. Because we in the West and in NATO and the Euro-Atlantic region need to recognize that Russia is never going to give up its determination to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign nation and to destroy NATO, to get rid of NATO or to neutralize NATO. Russia has set itself on that path. Russia is at war not only with Ukraine, but it's at war with the West. It thinks of itself as at war with NATO. And the only way that we are going to enjoy peace in the Euro-Atlantic region for generations to come is through a NATO band of deterrent steel to include Ukraine having defeated Russia.
Well, let's explore that. I mean, if you were going to draw up a plan, a strategy for the total defeat of Russia, and how you define that, I suppose, is an interesting question. But let's say it's returning Russia to its pre-2014 borders and returning the land that's been occupied ever since. Whether you think that's realistic or not is I suppose, a massive question. But what would be required to ensure that Ukraine could achieve that total victory?
Well, let's be clear. By total defeat of Russia, you're implying the sort of thing that was done to Germany in 1945. I'm not talking about that. That is never going to happen. I'm talking about defeat of Russian forces in Ukraine. Yes, I am talking about the return of Ukraine lands occupied since 2014. I am talking about Russia making, for example, the Crimea impossible for Russia to hold on to. I don't necessarily think you need to do that with what would be a massively complex, difficult, and horrendously expensive in terms of blood and treasure amphibious invasion of Crimea. But I do think you can make Crimea impossible for the Russians to hold on to. And to me, that is the center of gravity. And if Ukraine can hold on in its eastern provinces, continue to push back the Russians, or firstly to hold, but to push them back, but to focus on what I think is Russia's center of gravity here, which is Ukraine, and not just military, but political center of gravity, and make it impossible for Russia to hold on to through the application of long-range precision missiles and the like, then I think things could change very, very quickly. And there's another point I would make here. It's not just about giving Ukraine the means to defeat Russia. And by means, I mean long-range precision missiles, which have been, pretty, yes, HIMARS, yes, Storm Shadow, but where are the German Tauruses? There's a lot more to do. But it's also about not tying Ukraine's hands behind its back and allowing Ukraine to strike legitimate military targets in Russia with Western-supplied long-range precision missiles. We're still not there yet.
And again, that strikes me as highly surprising that, for example, it is largely the Americans who are imposing restrictions on where Ukraine can use US-supplied long-range missiles. And okay, I understand why certain NATO member states, such as Hungary, may have reluctance for their own domestic political reasons. But Joe Biden has been a very staunch supporter of Ukraine. It would be in Joe Biden's political interests and in America's strategic interests, you would have thought, to help Ukraine defeat Russia in the way you describe. And even though they've lifted some of the restrictions, are you still surprised that they're not going further? And why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to second guess the political judgments made in the Oval Office, but as an observer, I would suggest that there has been an excess of caution from the United States. Yes, of course, it's given a huge amount of weaponry and capability, much of which is, in a sense, it's being made in America. So it's good news for American industry and defense industries. But I think there's been there's been a sort of degree of self-deterrence as a result of Putin's nuclear saber rattling. And I think we should remember the maxim, Churchill's great line about Russia only respects strength. Where it finds weakness, it will continue to probe. And so it has proven in the last 2 years. That Russia has, and Putin and his henchmen, have waxed lyrical about the threat of nuclear weapons if tanks are deployed, if long-range weapons missiles are deployed. When it's been deployed, it's not come to anything. And of course, don't forget that President Xi has already breathed down Putin's neck, saying, nuclear weapons are out.
And I also thought it was fascinating at the NATO summit how, for the first time, you had NATO leaders pretty equivocally denouncing China's role in the war. Of course, Beijing would say it's officially neutral, but most analysts would say that's not really credible. What do you make of the upping of rhetoric against President Xi and his role?
Well, it's certainly recognizing that it is in China's interests that this war should continue, that China is supplying dual-use technologies directly to Russia. It's almost certainly providing material and equipment to North Korea, which is then being shipped on to Ukraine. And that China, is as Xi and Putin have said, this bond of unbreakable friendship between them. And I think it's putting a marker down to China that it's not going to have it all its own way. But at the same time, there's got to be recognition in the West that there's a clear linkage between what happens in Ukraine and what happens in the Asia Pacific. If Putin is seen to get away with it in Ukraine, that will almost certainly embolden Xi. And the so what out of all this, of course, is the importance for effective deterrence and a need to think globally, because Putin absolutely thinks globally. He's wound up South Korea with his action in North Korea. So they're now in the equation. And we need to think globally as well.
And just finally, Jamal, I wanted to ask you about some of the challenges facing Russia. Obviously, we talk a lot about the supply issues for Ukraine, but according to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russian military command may have committed under-equipped units initially intended to act as an operational reserve to combat operations, possibly due to constraints on the Russian defense industrial base. As I say, supply issues for Ukraine have been much discussed, but do you think there's a real issue for Russia as well at the moment?
I saw that, and I read ISW sit reps on a pretty much a daily basis, and I think what happened. I mean, I think they're very, very well informed, and I think it's for any organization trying to understand what's happening in this particular in this vital conflict for European and transatlantic interests. I really would highlight the importance of ISW's work. I think that is a highly likely deduction to draw. We were promised a major spring-summer offensive. Thus far, it hasn't materialized, and that one of the reasons might be just because of the reasons you've just cited. However, don't take it for granted. Who knows what Russia might be beginning to be building up and keeping behind its sleeve. But thus far, it hasn't happened.
General Sir Richard Shirreff, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you for having me, James. Good to talk.